The First Amendment begins, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press. Okay, we'll stop right there. Today, Christians and conservatives often find that their voices are being suppressed because their speech is something the left does not agree with. We see this in the mainstream media, and we also see it in social media in some cases. In effect, too often we have the idea of free speech for me, but not for thee. Well, right now we're going to have a talk with National Religious Broadcasters President Troy Miller about free speech and Christian broadcasting, as well as some other concerns to the NRB. I'm Jerry Newcombe, and this is Vocal Point. Doctor or Troy Miller, I don't know if you're doctor yet, but or even honorary, but it's great to have you, Mr. President Miller. Thank you for joining us.
It's great to be with you, Jerry. Thanks for having me.
Sure. Okay, first of all, is free speech in any way for Christians, is it at risk today?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, anybody who's on social media today knows that there are certain topics that if you talk about, you're probably going to end up violating the community standards for one of these social media organizations. And look, and we've seen it so many times in the news recently with the Twitter files that came out with Mark Zuckerberg's just confession of how the government coerced them into suppressing speech on certain topics, and some of those topics, especially pro-life, are very important to us as evangelicals.
Well, in one of our postings at providenceforum.org, which is a division of Coral Ridge Ministries, and we're, of course, good standing with the National Religious Broadcasters. So we had this little 5-minute video, and included Dennis Prager and the late Dr. Walter Williams, and the topic was a republic, not a democracy. And that is, the founders intended America to be a republic, not a democracy. Well, Facebook and at least that outlet said, we can't allow this. This is misinformation or whatever. And they took the post down as supposedly being false. Did anybody there ever read the Federalist Papers? Do they even know what they are?
Did they go through just basic civics classes back in the 1970s or 1980s, or you'd pick up the phone and call a professor? I think most people today, well, unfortunately, I guess maybe not most people, but anybody who does just a little bit of research finds out we're a constitutional republic. We're not a democracy. We're not guided by the will of the majority. As a matter of fact, our founding fathers went out of the way to protect minority opinions across this country with the way they structured the government. And the First Amendment was one of those key tools in doing that. So that's interesting that we also saw, Jerry, a lot of members right after the Dobbs decision came down. We had a member of Congress, several members of Congress, as a matter of fact, write Alphabet, which is the parent company of Google, and telling Google to change their search engine algorithms so that crisis pregnancy centers won't come back in the return when people go to search about a pregnancy or to get pregnancy help. And it won't come back in the return pages for several pages because, in their opinion, this was disinformation. So like your incident on the Constitution, we have those for political or ideological reasons that are deciding what is and what isn't speech.
That's a scary example that you just gave, because so often if I ever do Google type searches, I hardly ever get beyond the first page.
Oh, right. Yeah. Most people don't. I mean, the average, I think I looked it up once, the average person only goes 2 pages into a Google search. So once you get anything on the 3rd, 4th page or beyond, you're not going to see that information. And what we don't know from the Twitter files and from what Zuckerberg's told us about Meta, we have heard nothing from Alphabet about their cooperation with all of these government entities on suppressing speech. So we have no idea what these algorithms within the Google search engines are doing for things like, is this a constitutional republic? Or can you give me information on a crisis pregnancy? Or, hey, what does science say about gender?
All right, new issue, but it's still related to the overall issue of free speech. Tell us about the NRB's Johnson Amendment challenge. I assume the Johnson there is in reference to LBJ. Tell us about that.
That's right. It is a reference to LBJ when LBJ was a senator and running in Texas back in the 1950s. He was opposed by several churches across the state and some other organizations as well. He was opposed by them. When he became senator, he actually became, I believe, the Senate Majority Leader. So as a bill went through the Senate, he attached an amendment to it that is commonly known as the Johnson Amendment. This amendment had three pieces to it for nonprofit organizations. These are organizations that get what is called the 501c3 designation by the Internal Revenue Service, so that the donations given to them are considered just that donations and can be deducted from the donor's taxes. And so he put three provisions in there. One, the 501c3s can't give financially to campaigns. Two, that 501c3 organizations, including churches, which actually don't, they have that designation by design, but don't actually apply for it, cannot endorse or oppose candidates. And three, limits the amount of lobbying activity that the 501c3 organizations can do. Well, this has had a chilling effect on free speech. So think about this, Jerry. For up to 1957, pastors in this country could talk about any political, cultural topic that they wanted to, up and including endorsing or opposing candidates, until Lyndon B. Johnson came along and said, no, you can't do that anymore. And so we are taking the IRS to court for a couple of reasons. One, we think that this rule, and Jerry, we're only going after the middle. We're only going after the endorsing. We think that the giving money to candidates and the lobbying, that those two provisions are fine, but this endorsing, this silencing of speech of pastorates and nonprofit organizations is wrong. So we're taking the IRS to court for a couple of reasons. One, we think it's a violation of the First Amendment. Second, we also think that the IRS has unfairly enforced this in the fact that they have often went after conservative organizations, but have never gone after left-leaning organizations and churches that have candidates and pastors in there. So it won't affect this election cycle, but we want to right this wrong so that the freedom of speech that was enjoyed in this country from its founding can once again be put back in place.
Okay, in the battle over communications and the airwaves, I understand George Soros, a major funder of everything to the left, has some plans to acquire a lot of radio stations, and I would like you to tell us about that.
Yeah, so the second largest radio owner in this country, an organization called Audacity, they've been in bankruptcy court trying to, right themselves financially. And in comes George Soros. He comes in and his organization, and they're going to take a controlling interest in this, in Audacity. This was approved by a bankruptcy court, I believe early in the spring. I think it was back in March. That the bankruptcy court approved this, but they still needed regulatory hearings and regulatory approval for this to go through. And what has bothered us about this isn't so much that, George Soros is a businessman. He has every right to step in and buy businesses. But the FCC has agreed to, at least we think at this point, a waiver of what is called the foreign ownership rules. So what this means is when a foreign entity, of which George Soros's group is, when a foreign entity wants to buy U.S. media properties, they have to go through a process to ensure that entity is not interfering in any way in U.S. politics or U.S. policies. And so there's a process that the FCC goes through. Well, Audacity asked for a waiver for this, and it looks like the FCC is going to approve it, which would give them control of these 200 plus stations across the country just 35 days from a national election. And since we know George Soros already plays in and tries to influence with his left-wing agenda, we're sure that he's going to use these radio stations to do just that prior to a national election here in the U.S. And why is this waiver needed? Why is the FCC approving this? We just have a lot of questions to this. It seems, again, like favoritism toward the left by the government.
Wow. Okay, couple different issues as we have time. NRB stands in solidarity with Israel. That's an election issue too, isn't it?
Well, it is an election issue. It shouldn't be an election issue only because we have two candidates, one who has clearly expressed his support for Israel and Israel's sovereign right to defend itself, and another candidate who has constantly tried to interfere in that sovereign right of Israel to defend themselves. And, you know, I've made 2 trips to Israel this year. We have had a number of events with our counterparts and friends in Israel. And the evangelical community is one of the very few communities with almost without any exception has been standing arm in arm supporting the people of Israel for their right to defend their country and to defend their people. And we've called for a number of times for prayers for Israel, and we will continue to hold strong for that. That Israel, this is the land that God himself picked out of this whole world. He picked this land and gave it to the Jewish people. And as even the New Testament tells us, Paul tells us in Romans, the promises of God are irrevocable.
Okay, how about some comments about evangelicals and voting? It's still reported widely that, unfortunately, this is a voting bloc that doesn't show up, and yet if we did show up, we could probably change virtually every election.
Well, 2 problems here, Jerry. It's one is the problem of evangelicals showing up for election, as you said. The latest poll that came out by the Barna Group really shows that about 37% of evangelicals don't show up to vote, a God-given right in this country. And just to give you the impact of that was 7 million voters in the 2020 election that didn't show up in the key states that decided that election. So in the battleground states, 7 million voters didn't show up, and most of those races were decided by a 1% or less margin. And so this would have had a drastic change in the outcomes of those elections, not only at the presidential level, but all the way down the ticket. And on some key issues today that are also ballot issues that voted on. I think it's almost a dozen states that are going to have, pro-choice or abortion issues, as we should really call them, on the ballots for voters to vote. If Christians showed up at the polls and voted their conscience, we would see, I think, all of those defeated. But here's the other issue, Jerry. Nearly half of the Christians say that they are not really effectively informed on the issues that are going on in the culture today, and they don't follow them on a regular basis. And that's probably one of the reasons they don't vote, because they really don't know what's going on. And that's a problem that we have to fix, and that's a problem I think we have to fix in our pulpits.
Okay, we have 45 seconds left. Why is that, Troy? And with this, we can end. Why the apathy? And give us an encouragement to not be apathetic.
Well, look, we are given the country that we have a chance to control those who govern us. And that's look, I've traveled all over the world. That's a gift that most of the world doesn't have. And it's a gift God gave us. And if we really love our neighbor, we would vote in people that would live out Christian values and morals in our society today. We are seeing, here's the good news, Jerry. We are seeing a growing number of this amongst the Gen Zers, that they are getting more informed and more involved in voting what their beliefs, especially young evangelicals.
All right. NRB.org for more information. Troy Miller, always a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you so much.